On the night the elevator stalled between floors, Leonardo's voice in the dark asked me to trust him. By morning, rumors would scorch his name, and I would discover the secret that made my heart lurch. I was falling for my boss, the man everyone swore was dangerous to me. I didn't mean to fall in love with my boss. No one does, certainly not with a man like Leonardo Ramos. Impeccably dressed, careful with his words, a reputation you could cut yourself on. I first met him at orientation 3 years ago, when the HR director joked that operations runs on caffeine and fear. He'd smiled, not unkindly, and shook my hand. I noticed the steadiness of his grip and the way his eyes held mine, as if he was trying to assess not just my resume, but the spine inside my chest. "Benny," he said, "welcome to Archer West." His voice was not the bark I'd expected. It was low, deliberate, almost careful. I was 28 then, broke from grad school, grateful for the office on Wabash with its view of the river and the way the city lights at dusk turned the water into a ribbon of coin. He was my boss, the director of operations, the man people called bad when they were sure he was out of earshot. Bad for morale, bad for weekends, bad for anyone who preferred the soft edges of work to the sharp corners where he liked to live. I wanted to dislike him because it was safer. I tried to make a list. He was exacting. He sent emails with bullet points that felt like knuckles rapping a desk. He told me once during a review, "You're kind, Benny. Don't let that make you imprecise." The kindness landed like a compliment and a correction in the same breath. He believed in deadlines like people believe in church, and yet there were things that didn't fit the story. The janitor, Mr. Peters, walked slower after his back surgery, and one rainy Tuesday, I watched Leonardo take the mop out of his hands at 9 at night and say, "Let me." The man laughed, shook his head, and Leonardo started mopping the hallway. Not for show. There was no one there to see, but with a concentration so complete, it took my breath. Or how he kept an extra umbrella in his office and dropped it on the receptionist's desk before storms, quietly, without a word. Or the way he stood by a window late some nights, looking down at the street with a sadness so careful it seemed measured. "At least he keeps the lights on," my friend Marisol said, blowing on her coffee in the break room. Bad boss, good company. Chicago mortgage math. Nobody's perfect. She was right. It was not the kind of place where anyone promised easy. We had clients across the Midwest, contracts with hospital systems and logistics hubs that required careful choreography, boxes and data, and people moving in clean lines. When something snapped, it was our job to fix it. When a storm closed the freeway near Gary, when a strike shut down a warehouse in Rockford, when a client shipment of ventilators got stuck at a rural airstrip in Wisconsin, the call came to operations. And Leonardo answered, his voice calm at midnight, his shirt sleeves rolled, never asking why that late, only, "What's next?" He saw me, I think, before I saw myself. He put me in rooms I didn't believe I belonged in. The first time he asked me to present to a client, I stayed up to midnight, rewriting the deck until my words felt clean enough to put my name on. I barely slept, hands trembling, and when I looked up from the screen, he was watching me the way you watch a glass you've set inches from a cliff. "You're good at this," he said. "You don't know that yet." He smiled, just barely. "Benny, I hired you." I do not guess. I was careful at first not to linger. There is a way to like your boss, to respect them, to learn from them, and a way to risk everything in the quiet moments that come after 9 p.m., when the building is mostly dark and your eyes catch on the line of his jaw in the faint light of a desk lamp. I kept my voice steady. I laughed in a way that sounded friendly but not too warm. I watched for the invisible lines of propriety the way you watch for black ice in February, but love has a way of walking in through doors you didn't even realize were open. The night the elevator stalled between floors, I had 2 chicken salads in a paper bag and a head crowded with numbers. We were gearing up for the city contract, streamlining supplies to the new public health clinic on the south side. It was a good job, a meaningful one, the kind that made you want to put your best coat on and stand a little straighter. It was also the kind that could break our margins if we were clumsy. Leonardo stepped into the elevator with his coffee, nodded his thanks when I held the door. The air felt faintly metallic. We'd had a day of small fires, weather delays, a mispick at the warehouse, a client email that assumed we were magicians. Between floors 6 and 7, the box jolted. The lights flickered. We both looked up. The hum stopped so abruptly it left a hole. "Okay," he said in that even voice, pressing the button 3 times, then the emergency call. There was a quiet buzz, and a woman's voice came through, tinny and kind. "We're here," she said. "We'll send maintenance. Could be 20 minutes." He glanced at his watch. "Thank you." The lights returned to their usual soft glow. The elevator did not move. I let out a breath and tried to bank my nerves. It was so quiet that the sound of his coffee shifting in the cup seemed loud. He leaned his head against the wall. "Benny, do you trust me?" It wasn't flirtation. It was something steadier, a question asked in a voice with weight. My heart knew it anyway. It knocked against my ribs like it had found a drum. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how fast the word came. He looked at me for a long moment, as if my answer had touched something he hadn't let anyone touch in a while. "Good," he said. Then softer, almost to himself, "I need that." We didn't talk too much, just enough to make the minutes pass less slowly. He told me once about the night shift at a regional distribution center he'd worked right out of college to help his mother keep the lights on. How he learned to listen to the way a forklift sounded when the battery was on the edge. I told him how my grandmother taught me to cut butter into flour for pie crust, with patience, with cold hands. How something so simple was actually 100 small, careful choices. He smiled, really smiled, and the elevator started moving again with a lurch. By the time the doors slid open to the lobby, I had the strange sense that something unseen had shifted between us. Morning came with news. Rumors had a smell in our office, a kind of burnt sugar, and this one was sharp. By 9 o'clock, someone had passed around an anonymous email that named Leonardo in a scandal, questionable invoices, off-the-books payouts, fixing numbers for the city contract. It was ridiculous. Sloppy even, except sloppiness doesn't matter if panic gets there first. 3 desks down, a junior analyst whispered, "He's going to be fired." Someone else muttered, "Maybe he should be." I found Leonardo in his office, standing very still. The morning light found the grey threads in his hair and the lines by his eyes. He had the email printed, words black and loud on white paper, and it looked coarse in his neat hand. He didn't look up until I knocked. "Do you have a minute?" He folded the paper in half. "For you, I do." We talked like everything was normal. We reviewed the clinic rollout plan. We scheduled a call. I asked about a missing PO number. And then, just as I was about to stand, he said, "They'll say what they say. People talk." "They do," he said. "And sometimes they're right. I should have left it there." But the elevator had changed something. His voice in the dark, his question and my answer. "If there's anything you need," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I'm here." He stared at me for a few seconds that felt longer. "Don't choose sides too soon," he said quietly. "It's easier to forgive yourself if you wait for the facts." He was placed on administrative leave that afternoon, pending a review, which is how corporate America says, "We see the smoke, and we are willing to put you outside until we know if you lit the match." The office felt colder without him. My team was folded into another manager's orbit, a man named Sutton, with a good tie and a practiced smile, who used the word buddy so often you might forget your name. The first meeting in his conference room, he patted my shoulder and said, "We'll keep that clinic project right on track, buddy. Don't you worry," which is exactly what people say when they're going to trip all over what you built. I went home that night to my small apartment near the Brown Line, my hands shaking even after I had washed the dishes and folded the towels, and done all the things my grandmother would have done when life felt too big. The city outside was a polite kind of cold, the sound from the street settling like snow. I could not stop seeing Leonardo's face, calm and unhappy, the way still water looks deep. I didn't know if I was a fool for believing in him. I didn't know if maybe the thing everyone said was right, if I had fallen for an image he projected, competence, crispness, care that looked like control. At midnight, my phone vibrated. One new message. A number I didn't recognize. A text with no greeting. We should talk. Tonight, if you can. Please. I stared at it long enough to feel my pulse in my throat. I typed, "Who is this? Leonardo. I'm sorry for the hour." He sent an address near the river. I did not think. I put my coat on, locked my door, and walked into the kind of cold that wakes you. The sidewalks were mostly empty. The building he shared, brown brick, old stonework, sat on a quiet street with a narrow tree out front. The lobby was clean with the faint smell of lemon oil, a table with a bowl that held keys and a small ceramic rabbit. He opened his door before I could knock. He looked different outside the office. No tie, a soft grey sweater, an expression that made him seem younger and older at once. He stood back, letting me in. A lamp was on in the corner. A city map hung on the wall, framed, with small pins marking places I assumed he loved. On his kitchen counter was a loaf of bread wrapped in a towel, fresh baked, the kind with a dark crust that crackled when he touched it. "I bake when I can't sleep," he said, following my gaze. "I make pie," I blurted, because my brain didn't know the difference between small talk and confession. He smiled, and it was not the careful work smile, but something gentler. "Of course you do." I stood in his living room like the floor might move. He gestured to a chair. "Thank you for coming," he said. He stopped, collected himself. "I don't want to ask you to do anything that would hurt you. I shouldn't have texted. You can go." "I'm here," I said, sitting, my coat bunched up beside me like a shield. "And tell me what you need." He sat across from me, leaned forward, and rested his elbows on his knees, the way he did when he was building something with his whole mind. "I've been investigating our CFO for 6 months," he said, and the room shifted. I didn't want to. I tried not to, but I kept seeing numbers that didn't make sense. Small things. Shipping costs that spiked on Thursdays, phantom invoices to a vendor that might as well be a ghost, charitable donations filed like refunds. I followed the thread. It led to a mess, and the person holding the end is someone who likes to set fires and hand you the matches. "Why you?" "Because I'm operations," he said. "Because I had access to the flow. Because when you speak softly and tell people their forklift is a little loud before it dies, they tell you things. Because I am bad enough to be blamed and careful enough to live through it." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "I built a file. An evidence trail. I wanted to bring it to the board next week. Then today happened. Today, suddenly, I am the leak in the roof." He stood, restless, walked to the window, and watched the quiet street as if it was a sentence he was trying to pass. "I'm sorry, Benny. I don't know if I should have told you. I'm not asking you to betray anyone." My heart felt too big for my chest. It thudded in a way that reminded me of running in grade school, a joy and a panicked ache. "You think Sutton's part of it?" "I think Sutton is a man who thinks he deserves more and is eager to sit where the light hits," he said. "But I don't know. I only know what I can prove." He turned, and his face was unguarded. "You trusted me in an elevator," he said. "That carried me a whole day. I needed it to remember who I am when people start telling me who I'm not." We ate bread we broke with our hands and talked until 2 in the morning. He showed me documents on his tablet, vendor lists, payment dates, a simple diagram he'd drawn that made the mess suddenly clear. The off-the-books payouts from the rumor were actually diverted funds, a quiet siphon to a shell entity the CFO controlled. The anonymous email had been a preemptive strike, a cloud of doubt thrown like a blanket over a fire that could warm you or burn you, depending on who stood nearest. "I can help," I said at one point. And maybe I meant with the numbers, but my voice made it sound as if I meant with the weight. He looked at me for a long time. "You already are." When I left his building, the cold felt clean. I walked fast as if I could outpace my own fear. I knew what it would mean to stand next to him in this. I knew the optics. I knew the HR trainings. I knew that if anyone bothered to look, they would see right through me, to the part that woke at night, thinking about his steady hands. The way he said my name, like it belonged to me and also to him. The next week was a balancing act on a wire I could barely see. At work, Sutton called me Buddy and invited me to meetings where he smiled and said, "We're going to do this the right way, by the book," as if he were the author. Afterward, he slapped my back as if I were a vending machine that might drop a soda if rattled. I kept my face pleasant. I answered questions with care. I stayed late to fix what he broke with his shortcuts, which is a thing you learn to do when your name is on the line and the calendar won't change for anyone. At night, I met Leonardo in quiet places with unreliable lighting. His kitchen, a bench by the river, the front seat of my car. Our voices low because the world had tilted and we did not want to fall out. He was careful with me always. He did not touch my hand even when it shook. He did not close the space between us, even when it seemed like the only way I could take a full breath was to step closer. When I told him he could trust me, he nodded like a man who hears the words he most wants to live by and knows how dangerous they can be. We built the case together. We pulled reports at odd hours. We compared the legitimate to the suspicious. We found the pattern. I used my access to assemble clean data trails and sent them to him through an encrypted drive he taught me to use with a patience that made my chest ache. He had a contact on the board, Ms. Delaney, a woman whose beauty was in her backbone, who had asked him months earlier, "If something is wrong, would you tell me even if it's messy?" He had said yes. Now he was ready to show her what the mess looked like on a Thursday afternoon. Sutton gathered the team to announce that he was sunshining some processes, which is corporate for making sure light hits the places we usually keep dim. He made a joke about vampires. People laughed because it was easier. After the meeting, he called me into his office. The blinds were half closed, the lights slatted, a kind of quiet verdict. "You like Ramos," he said, not unkindly. "I respect him," I said, "because in polite rooms we use polite words." He nodded. "He's in trouble," he said, "and anyone near him will be in trouble too. I'm giving you a chance to take a step back. Don't let admiration make you clumsy. A step back." He meant to say, "Choose yourself." It was, in a way, a kindness. It was also a threat wrapped in a blanket. I could have let it cover me. My grandmother made quilts for winters like that. But love is warmth you choose not to hoard. I went home that night and wrote what I knew. A timeline that fit cleanly, a packet that would make sense to someone who did not know us. I sent it to Leonardo. He replied with a simple thank you, and I stared at the words longer than I should have. The Friday before the board meeting, I found an envelope on my desk. Inside, a grainy photo of me leaving Leonardo's building, my head bent, my hands in my pockets. No note, no signature. A thin way of saying, "We see you." I felt a small, precise fear bite the inside of my lip. I took a deep breath. I walked to the copier, made a copy of the photo, and placed it in a folder labeled Security. Then I went back to work. When the clock reached 5, I stayed. At 9, I left. I did not go to Leonardo's that night. I sat at my kitchen table and ate pasta and watched the sky darken, my phone face down on the placemat, the world very large, and me very small, and still somehow stable. The board meeting came on a Monday, as these things often do, as if a week needs to begin with a pain you can manage, a careful knife, a reminder that time moves, whether or not you are ready. I wore my best suit. I told Marisol I had a dentist appointment because I was not ready to tell anyone anything that mattered. The boardroom was a bright, kind room with a view of rooftops. Ms. Delaney sat at the head of the table. The CFO sat 4 seats down, his smile as smooth as a dress shirt. Sutton hovered near the door in case anyone needed a buddy. Leonardo walked in with a folder and a calm that felt like a choice. He nodded to me in a way that said, "We know what we know." He began to speak. He spoke the way he always had, quietly, confident in the facts, and unwilling to sharpen them into knives he did not need. He presented the pattern. He laid the timelines beside the bank statements like scaffolding you could climb. He asked for time for an outside audit. He said, "I will accept any consequences if I am wrong." And the room heard the thing underneath, the part where he understood what it means to risk yourself on something solid. The CFO laughed once, a soft scoff he probably thought was charming. He said it was all a misunderstanding, a tangle of cash flow and vendor relations, department lingo polished to shine. He produced emails that suggested Leonardo had approved certain payments. He glanced toward me and said, "Some of our analysts are enthusiastic, Ms. Delaney. They build castles out of spreadsheets. We'll give them sand, and they'll swear it's rock. He should not have insulted the people who can count." Ms. Delaney turned to me. "Mr. Flores," she said, using my last name as if it belonged to someone older and braver, "would you step to the table?" My heart hammered. I stood. I'd told myself I was 40% water and 60% spine. I took the chair. My hands were steady because I had done the work. I presented the workflows I'd stitched together late at night. The way the vendor shells always showed up on Thursday afternoons, because that's when a certain accountant signed off while his supervisor was on her weekly commute home. I showed the emails the CFO had waved around, with headers that had been tampered with in a way anyone could see if they knew where to look. I spoke slowly. I did not look at Leonardo because if his face showed pride, I might not have been able to finish. "There's something else," I said, and slid the envelope with the grainy photo across the table. "I believe there has been an attempt to intimidate a staff member to keep them from assisting in an internal review. I do not know by whom, but this is what intimidation looks like, when people like to pretend they are not touching you." The room was very quiet. Miss Delaney took the photo and looked at it longer than it deserved. She placed it down with care, as if careful handling could make it less ugly. "Thank you," she said to me. "You've been very clear." She called for a recess. People stood and pretended to stretch. Leonardo went to the window. I stood a few feet away, hands in my pockets, staring at the table as if it could tell me how to live. He moved closer. We did not touch. He said very softly, "You were steady. So were you." "I am trying to be someone I can respect," he said. "That is all I know." The board ordered an outside audit. The CFO was suspended pending findings. Sutton disappeared like smoke. The city contract moved ahead. Work as it always does continued. I went back to my desk. Some people looked at me like I had grown 2 inches. A few looked at me like I had misplaced my sense. No one said, "Buddy." That night I fell asleep at 7 and woke at 2 to a quiet that felt like a hand on my shoulder. There is an exhaustion that comes after you do the thing you cannot quite believe you did. A hollow, clean kind of tired. I made tea. I stood by the window and watched the vacant street, the way the city sleeps and does not. In the weeks that followed, the audit came back crisp. The CFO resigned with a statement about focusing on family, which is what people say when they mean avoiding handcuffs. Leonardo was reinstated. Our team quietly returned to his care. He thanked us in a meeting so brief it was almost nothing at all. When it ended, people clapped their palms against their thighs because applauding felt like crossing a line. And we had all learned to mind them. A few nights later, I walked into his office after everyone had left. He was at his desk, sleeves rolled, the familiar groove between his eyebrows. He looked up. Something in his face let go. "Stay," he said, and it sounded like a prayer. I sat in the chair across from him. We were quiet for a long time. The city lights came on one by one, and the river held them. "I don't know how to be your boss and be the way I want to be with you," he said finally, the words careful, reverent. "I am not proud of all the things I do well. I am proud of the things I choose not to do when I'm tired and could get away with them. This," he gestured between us, "this can't be a thing we hide in elevators or in the space between sentences. If it is a thing at all, it has to be something we can be proud of." "I know," I said, my throat tight with something that was both love and discipline. "We can do this right," he nodded. "I can ask HR to move you. There's a role on the clinic project management side opening at the end of the month. It would be lateral in title, up in pay. You'd report to Sandra. She will be kinder and less precise. You'll have to teach her where the screws go. I can't make the ask without risking pointing at something we don't want people to point at. But I can open a door. You can choose to walk through." I laughed. a small breath of relief. "Even now," I said, "you're giving me decisions with IKEA-level instructions." He smiled. "I do love a manual. We were careful about the thing in our hands because we wanted to keep it." I applied for the transfer. I got it not because he asked, but because my record in the past few months had written a neat letter on my behalf. My last day on Leonardo's team, he stopped at my desk. He did not touch me. He said, "Thank you for your work. Archer West is better because you were here." I swallowed. I said, "We all make the river move." He understood. We went to our separate meetings, our separate responsibilities, the adult way the world asks you to be both brave and careful. On a Saturday in late spring, after the city had swapped its coat for a cardigan, we met at the farmer's market near the museum. He stood by a stand of rhubarb, smiling at something the farmer had said, and I felt a quiet spread through me that was its own kind of courage. We walked with coffee, talked about the strawberries that tasted like July, the dog with the one ear. We were two men among other people doing ordinary things, which is what I had wanted most of all. "Come over," he said at the end of the aisle, his voice a question but also a promise. "I'll show you how not to ruin bread. I'll show you how not to ruin pie," I said, and he smiled. In his kitchen, sunlight touched the wood in a way that made the room feel grateful. We measured and stirred. We laughed at a mess I made with flour because I forgot to start with a bowl. He corrected me gently. I corrected him with a seriousness that made him laugh, that warm laugh I had only heard late at night when no one else was listening. We baked bread with a crackle that sounded like a new beginning. We cooled a pie on the sill like we were in a story about people who have gardens and go to bed early. When the timer dinged, we stood close, and there was no HR policy in the room. Only two people who had waited long enough to know what they were waiting for. I touched his face with my flour-dusted fingers and said, "I am in love with my bad boss." He looked at me with a softness I did not know he had in him, a vocabulary of gentle I would spend years learning. "I have never wanted to be worse at anything," he said, "but I'll try." We kissed. It was a simple kiss, honest and shy, the kind that does not perform, the kind that lets you know you are safe. He put his forehead to mine and whispered my name like a promise. People imagine love as heat, and it is sometimes. But love is also a steady room, a chair you can sit in when your hands shake. Love is a grocery list, a calendar invite, a text that says home in 10. Love is the ability to tell someone a hard thing and trust they will not run, even if running would be easier. We built a life in ways that would look small from the outside. Laundry folded, an old wooden table we sanded together. The nightly process of turning off lights like a ritual. On Sundays we drove to see my mother. She liked him immediately, the way mothers like men who don't smile too fast. He asked her about the recipe for her enchiladas and listened like he was taking notes for a class he would never skip. He had no family left to bring me to, so we built one out of what we had. On Thursdays, we had dinner with Marisol and her wife, and they told us we were obnoxious with our baking. We laughed and brought dessert anyway. At work, I learned to be a leader who looks people in the eye and says, "We can do the hard thing," and means it. He moved into a VP role and made it his job to teach people how to be precise without cruelty. He still felt the urge to hold everything in his hands. He still had to remember to let go. On days when old habits tugged at him, he stood at the window and watched the city and took a breath and tried again. When the first big snow fell that winter, we walked along the river at night, the lights making a soft bruise on the water. He tucked his hand into my glove because he had forgotten his and refused to admit it. We laughed and our breath came out in clouds. He leaned his head on my shoulder like a boy stealing a moment on a crowded bus. I knew then, in a sure way, that this was what I had been learning to trust. Not the moments when the elevator stalls and life asks you if you're brave, but the ones where it doesn't, and you choose to be anyway. The day we signed the lease on the apartment with the blue door, the building manager handed us the keys like he was handing us a small moon. We stood in the empty living room and heard our voices bounce off the walls. He looked at me and said, "We have to fight fairly." I said, We have to make more than we break. He said, we have to tell the truth. I said, we have to keep baking. We shook hands with a solemnity that lasted 2 seconds before I laughed, and he did. Time, generous in its quiet way, leaned forward. We were not perfect. We argued about shelves and money, and whether you should rinse plates before the dishwasher. You should. He worked late some nights and forgot to call, and when he came through the door with an apology, I told him gently that being busy is not an excuse for making someone wait in the dark. He told me gently that I sometimes said yes to too much, because I wanted to be loved, and that he loved me even when I said no. We chose to tell the truth, even when it meant we had to sit on the couch and hold hands like we were in church, waiting for the hymn to carry us. Years later, when the city awarded Archer West a contract to build out emergency response networks for rural clinics, when the news cameras came and filmed our office, a young reporter asked Leonardo, "How did you restore trust in a division with a history of problems?" He paused, thought, and then said, "You restore trust the way you maintain good machinery. You listen for what's off. You fix what you can reach, and you keep your hands clean." The camera caught my smile in the background, and the internet said things about the man with the steady eyes. They did not know we went home that night and ate soup and fell asleep on the couch during the second half of a movie. If there was a day when the love felt like a decision again, a thing we could hold up and say, "Look what we made," it was the afternoon we stood on our stoop and watched a summer storm roll in. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and wind pressed the trees into trembling. He stood behind me, his chin on my shoulder, his arms around my waist. The storm sighed across the city, and rain came down in clean lines. We went inside and closed the door and put bread in the oven, windows fogging, and the house smelled like what people mean when they say home. He still wakes sometimes and goes to the window. I wake with him. We stand together and look out at the sleeping street. He says, "Do you trust me?" And I say yes, because the answer is a thing we make with our choices every day. I tell him he's not a bad boss anymore. He says, "I am a man who has learned to treat power like a borrowed coat." I say, "Wear it well." He smiles and kisses my hair, and we go back to bed. The simple act that feels sacred after everything else has been said and done. People say love should be an answer. I think it's a door. You open it. You walk through. You keep walking together until your feet know the floor and you don't need to look down. You stop only when the bread rises and the pie cools and the city sleeps and the person you once met in a stalled elevator is sleeping beside you, breathing even safe, the danger never gone from the world, but something steady growing anyway in the place where your hands meet.